So, one, thank you for coming today. And as I said, we're going to talk about long-term philanthropic sustainability with kind of a parachurch, missionary, and also just general organizational bent to it. And the focus will be everything from understanding mission vision alignment, case development, how donor behavior operates within the context of values-based relationships around sustainability, and why that matters, and how we create impact and change. And the short kind of overview of our company and myself, obviously I'm Jamie Levy, and our company really focuses on two areas. One is long-term sustainability for charitable not-for-profit organizations, and that looks like board development, long-term fundraising planning, organizational impact evaluation and growth. And the other end of the spectrum, we work with philanthropists and grant-making foundations, helping them to understand the kind of social impact they're trying to create, and then to build the structure to help them do that, and then guide them in implementation of it. And our client base, any given year is probably 60 to 65% domestic, U.S.-based organizations, and the other remaining of that are international. We do a lot of work in Africa and the Middle East. And I'll share some of those examples today as we process through things. And they range from, literally small mom and pop organizations that are individual missionaries in the field to National Geographic, and kind of everywhere in the spectrum between there. And so we'll pull a number of those things out as we go through today. And my side hat is I'm also a faculty member at Indiana University, where I teach in our graduate nonprofit management programs in the fundraising school and the School of Philanthropy. So that's kind of the context of where we're going. I'll share a lot of research as well as we go through things. So don't hesitate to ask a question about the research, but just know that I'm not going to bring research out if it's because I heard it from a small focus group in Houston. Everything that I'll bring out, if it's outside of our company, will have a lot of context. If it's within our company, give you an example, I'll share a lot about just donor behaviors and donor perceptions and what donors tell us they want. And that would be internal to our company as well. And we have data on either phone, face-to-face interviews, or electronic survey assessments of we're probably north of 120,000 donors, where we've asked questions about what do they think about their giving, their relationships, what they need, what they have concerns about, et cetera. So I'll bring a lot of that in today and share that as we go through the day. But the first thing we're going to start off with, you have a little packet. So if you open that packet up, we're going to talk about this word philanthropy. And as we think about the word philanthropy, what does that mean to you? When you see that word?
Generous giving.
So you think about generous giving of money, okay, which is one of the three pillars of philanthropy. So how we give of God's resources, his money through us. When you think about the word, what does that mean? Love, absolutely. So philanthropy just simply means love of man. And that's it. That's all the word philanthropy comes back to, is the word love of man. And that's expressed through three pillars. The first is how we give of God's money. What else, when you think about philanthropy, do you think of? Time, absolutely. So how we share our giftedness and our time through volunteerism. And the third one is advocacy. And interesting, the word advocate comes from the derivative of the word to intercede or intercession, which we all know a lot about. The idea that we stand in the gap with something that we value equally or more than ourselves, to be a bridge, to be a partner, to accompany across in intercession. And so the three pillars of philanthropy get expressed through how we give of God's resources, how we share his giftedness, and then how we become intercessors, advocates for what it is that he has called us to care about, to be aligned in value relationship with. Of those three, what's the most common form that philanthropy is expressed in society, do you think? Which one do you most commonly hear about?
I think giving of money.
Absolutely. So we often take philanthropy, and the one that we hear the most about is giving of money. And when you think about giving of money, what do we typically hear about? right? What kind?
Big ones.
Big ones, that's right. So we take the idea of money, and we hear about Warren Buffett, we hear about Bill Gates, we hear about individuals that are making large gifts to charitable organizations. So we take money and we further diminish it to not being how the populace gives in civil society, but about how an elite small group of wealthy individuals give. What's interesting is of the $390 billion, which is how much money, 390.2 billion that's given on an annual basis to charitable organizations, of that, depending on whose research you follow, IU, Harvard, Case Western, there's some different researches out there, but the range is that typically somewhere between low 50s to low 60% of all money given in the United States comes from families that make $100,000 or less on an annual basis. So the idea that there is this elite group of individuals that make all of the financial contributions to charitable organizations in the United States, just it's not there. Giving is much more of a broader bell curve than it is a sharp pyramid, if that makes sense. So we take the idea of philanthropy, love of man, and we diminish it to being about how we love money, which is so common, right? We see that in society in so many other ways. But we take this transformative focus of loving man, which I believe starts with God's first act of creation, how he so loved us that then he created, and then John 3:16, he so loved the world that he gave everything. But we take philanthropy and we diminish it to how we give money and how a select few give money, as opposed to understanding the full context of how society shares God's resources. And when we think about this from a giving perspective, and we're going to come back to this a couple of different ways, does anybody want to take a guess what percentage of giving in the United States comes from businesses of the $390 billion?
15%.
So 15? Okay. Any other guesses?
20.
20?
I'm going to say 10.
10? Any others? So 5% comes from the for-profit sector or the corporate sector. Approximately 14 to 15% comes from foundations, grant makers. What's interesting in that number, we have these things called family foundations, which you may or may not be familiar with, which and family trusts, which are basically just legal vehicles that somebody has set up as a family to still give through. Very different than, say, the Ford Foundation or the Lilly Endowment, in which we have an independent group of individuals who are following directives by a founding either charter or a founding individual from years ago that aren't family members. So a family foundation or a family trust is still a major gifts relationship, meaning it's still intimate, it's still personal, it's individuals in the family making decisions about how they're going to carry out their shared values. Those
Tax deduction right away, we understand.
for a foundation, it's part of their payouts, the requirements that they have. Right, so the deduction impacts a little differently than if I just gave it individually because it now is a part of a legal vehicle. But that's still an individual giving relationship.
Not a foundation.
Right, but we track it under foundations, but it's still really more individual driven. And that's about, depending on whose research, we're going to round that to about 6% of foundation giving comes from these individual families that have legal vehicles set up. So if you take that 6% out and you add, or take 6% away from 15, we're left with 9%. Is what the real number looks like here. And so if I add 9 and 5, what do I have? 14. And if I take that away from 100, what am I left with? Right. So depending on rounding, I'm running about 86 to 87% of all money in the United States actually comes from individuals, which is a lot different than what popular media makes us believe. And of this, we already talked about what this looks like by way of giving. This isn't some small elite group that gives all the money in the country, but this is a team sport in a sense. People are engaged in philanthropy, the monetary side of how they express God's love of man through giving. And that looks very different when we start to look at the numbers. What's also interesting is these ratios haven't really changed more than 1 or 2 or so percentage points in the last 55 plus years that it's been tracked formally. So this is what it typically is going to look like every year. This is the only one that really fluxes much, which is individual foundations and grant makers combined. But again, there's a percentage of that that's family foundations, which is still a major gift, individual gift relationship. So when we look at, again, still thinking about money, we've now talked about how we express philanthropy most commonly, which is through giving of money, and then what that looks like holistically within the United States. The other interesting thing is if I take a chart, and if this is time, and this is money, historically, with 2 small blips, giving in the United States has increased. Right now it runs on average, proportion of income is about 1.9% of income goes to charity. But total giving in real dollars, which is what matters, because real dollars, the dollar who makes a gift, or the donor who makes a gift in, say, January, doesn't care that by the end of the year, that gift has 1% less buying power because of inflation. All they know is last year I gave 95 cents and this year I gave $1. And that's an increase in behavior for me, an increase in sacrifice for me. So when we look at real dollar giving, every year except for 2, 1987 because of tax restructuring, which really wasn't a decrease, but it came out to look like a decrease because people pushed their giving differently because of the tax change. And then right out of the recession, 2008, 2009. But even then, total giving dropped only about 2.5%. And individual giving dropped less than 1% during the recession. Those are the only 2 drops we've ever seen in real dollar giving in the United States. So every year, total giving, and I'm just putting a T and a G here, total giving has increased every year since it's been tracked formally. Giving to religious causes has also increased right along with it with 2 little blips. So giving to religious causes, so that would be parachurch and church. So Young Life would be a part of that. The formal church would be a part of that. Missionary giving would be a part of that. Every year, tracking except for those blips, giving to overall religious causes has increased. Ever since, when giving overall increased until about 1969, it started to stagnate a little bit, continued to increase. In 1994, it started to decrease, and since 1994, every year since, giving to the church formal has decreased, while giving to religious causes has increased. So the idea that somehow common society is not giving to religious things anymore doesn't hold up. The idea that common society isn't giving into the formal church anymore does hold up. So giving overall increases, giving to religious causes increases, but giving to the church for about the last 25 years has decreased to the point where now giving to the church formal is about 27, 28 to 32%, depending on whose research you use, compared to other giving, whereas literally in the 90s, giving to formal church was well over 50%. And the first notice that we took that giving to the church was declining was in 1969. I mean, that's when we first started to see that something was happening with the church, but nobody really cried alarm until 2007 and then 2010 and then 2014 when we started seeing high magnitude studies saying, okay, people aren't giving to the church anymore. And this is really important for parachurch ministries as well, because what I want you to see is that people are still religiously affiliated in their giving. It's just that it looks a little different than what it did 25 or 30 years ago. So when you think about giving overall, there are a couple things I want to hit with this, and we're going to talk about who gives in just a second. But one is, when you look at people who stop giving, so I have 100 people who love cats, and they're giving to an organization that shares that value of loving cats. Within a year, there's a percentage of them that are going to stop giving to that organization. They still love cats. They're just going to go love cats somewhere else. Does anybody want to take a guess what percentage of that 100 donors will stop giving within the year? These are existing relationships that will stop giving, still love cats, are just going to go love cats in a different organization? What percentage do you think of those donors will stop giving within the year?
40%.
Okay, 40?
That's gonna be my guess, 35, 40%.
I'd say 20.
20? Anybody else?
25.
25? So the percentage right now, again, I'm always going to give you a range on the research because the research isn't exact. There are a number of different sources. But the research puts attrition, which is what we're calling this, just annual attrition, at somewhere between 72 to 82%. That's the percentage of donors that will stop giving during the course of the year. The number one reason that donors in the United States and Canada stop giving is because of a word called indifference. They just believe that nobody valued the relationship. They still love cats. They didn't have an economic issue, right? They just believe that people didn't value the relationship. There's some really cool research that shows that a donor, if they're giving to a not-for-profit organization as opposed to a missionary, but if they're giving to a general not-for-profit organization, that a donor who receives a phone call from a member of the board to simply say, thank you and you matter, that on average those donors give 56% more in the following year, even if nothing else happens. And that's all they do. They just get a phone call. So that's the impact that that has on the relationship with an individual, which is huge. If we had an economic issue, I can't fix economics. I can't make up for the fact that somebody gives less because maybe they've had an economic change. But when you look at this trend line, this goes through economic crises, this goes through world crises, this goes through domestic crises, and what we know is people continue to give generously. There's a great saying that if you want to know who's going to give generously tomorrow, look at who's giving generously today. The question becomes, how do we then nurture and empower those relationships that are in true shared value relationships? So we're going to start to make a bridge into volunteerism, the idea of how we give of our gifts and our time to the things that we care about. One thing we know, again, depending on the research, but on average, the research tells us that somewhere between about 70-ish to about 85-ish, there's a range in there, of all individual donors in the United States are volunteers. So if I want to know the number one driver of who gives in the United States, it's who's volunteering. And that doesn't mean that if I'm giving here, I'm volunteering there, but it means if I'm giving here, the vast majority of donors that are giving are volunteering somewhere else. Or people who are volunteering are financially giving somewhere else. What we also know is that the number one driver of where planned gifts go in the United States, meaning gifts that are made by estate transfer, insurance policy, simple will, the donor who says, I want you to have a third of whatever I have left over when I die, the number one driver of where planned gifts go in the United States is where that individual volunteered in their last, most active phase of life. So those are intimately connected. We know the number one driver of who makes the highest or the biggest major gifts to charitable organizations are people who are volunteering. We know that the number one driver of long-term donor loyalty are donors who are also volunteers. We know that donors who make the most frequent gifts to charitable causes during the course of a year are donors who are also volunteers. Do you think that these are intimately connected? Absolutely. So where people give has a big impact on who's volunteering and vice versa. What's also interesting is that the average annual volunteer attrition rate, meaning the percentage of donors who will stop volunteering during the course of a year, averages 67%. So to see if you can put this together, can anybody tell me what you think the number one reason is that volunteers stop giving of their time would be? And the answer is implied up here.
They don't feel appreciated.
Right, because the vast majority of volunteers are what? Donors. And the same reasons that donors stop giving parallel the same reasons those individuals stop giving of their time. They don't feel that anyone values the relationship, which then impacts attrition. I still love cats, I just go love cats somewhere else. So these are intimately disconnected. In the United States, this looks like, depending on whose research, nearly $300 billion a year in volunteer labor value to the United States. Do you think that my ability to be a financial donor, using God's resources to impact His kingdom financially, using my giftedness in my time to make a difference in what He's called me to do, has an impact on my ability to be a true advocate for something that I'm wired to care about? Meaning, if I'm engaged in both of these as opposed to one or the other, do you think that being engaged in both has an impact on my ability to become a stronger advocate for what I care about? Absolutely. It doesn't mean that the person who doesn't volunteer can't still be an advocate. It just means that when I hit on both cylinders, the third pillar of philanthropy gets expressed at an even stronger, more intimate level. But that also means I have to think differently about volunteerism, that I can't put volunteerism into this box. And a lot of the federal research looks at volunteerism by way of paid labor value equivalence of substitution, meaning that volunteerism is only counted if you're replacing a paid labor equivalent. But a lot of organic grassroots volunteerism doesn't get captured into those assessments. But we know that's volunteerism. If I help at a special event, if I come in and drop in and mentor someone, all of these things that we do, serving on a board, all of these things have an impact and are part of how we volunteer. So here is a question for you to think about. So one of the positions I used to have in the field, I was executive director of an organization, and when I came into that organization, I came in as their senior development officer, and I was told when I was hired that I could do anything I wanted in the organization. I could go into our endowment and hire staff, I could remove staff, whatever I want to do to rebuild our fundraising and long-term development program, except for one thing. We used, at the time, 3,500 volunteers, which equated to almost $3 million of our labor budget. And I was told that the only thing I could not do was ask our volunteers to make a financial contribution. So why do you think that insecurity existed? Like, why was the board and the CEO so concerned that I could do whatever I wanted, but I could not ask our volunteers to financially give to the cause? What was going on there?
Because they're already giving so much that you're worried that they'll feel offended or not want to continue.
That's right. So the insecurity was that if I'm engaged here or here, I wouldn't want to be a part of the other. Because they don't understand, and they didn't understand, that philanthropy operates holistically. If God's called me to care about how I express love of man, then philanthropy is how I find my greatest relationship, my greatest potential in expressing the three things He's given me and sharing that love of man. How I become a person, a source for Him to function in His economy and give of His resources, a God of abundance as opposed to a God of scarcity. How I give of myself, my time, my giftedness, and then how I become an intercessor for what it is that He has called me to be about in my life. But if I view the donor as a checkbook, if I view the volunteer as free labor, then I'm always going to have an insecurity that if I have you volunteering and I ask you to give, you're not going to want to, because now we're talking about a limited relationship. Because my focus isn't how do I help you become an advocate, my focus is how do I get you to give more time? And they're dramatically different. Does that make sense? And if my focus is just how do I get you to give more money as opposed to how do I get you to engage holistically in the potential God's created you for, then I'm always going to have an insecurity about how you give or how we give of our time. I won't come to this place of helping the individual become an advocate for the cause, and often I won't see my organization or my cause as truly cause-centric or being a movement. It typically will be about I do this thing, and you give your checkbook to this thing, or you give your hour to this thing, as opposed to how do we create a cause in which we engage people to become intercessors for something that God has wired them to be about. It's interesting when we ask donors in the field and we survey them, in our case, survey, phone, or face-to-face interviews over well over 100,000 donor data points. And we ask donors, what's the one thing that they want to know more about? We run something like 67%, 68% of donors say, I want to know more about how I can engage my time to make a difference. When we ask volunteers the same question, volunteers will tell us, I want to know more about how I can make a difference around the financial situation in the organization. So they're asking for the information in the field, but so often we have this bias of insecurity that's set in that keeps us from seeing someone holistically, which then keeps us from building relationship holistically. And then unfortunately causes the person who loves cats not to find how they can impact whatever it is that they're called about in the greatest way. So any questions on this before we move a little deeper with
Are
it?
there any numbers on, you were talking about attrition stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious, the people that are giving their money and time to the same thing, if there's numbers on the, because I would imagine it's a lot less attrition if they're engaged.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. We have a client that we're working with right now that their DNA has always been very holistic, and they have right now the lowest donor attrition rate that we've ever seen in the open field. They're running 28% donor attrition before we've even done anything with them, which is amazing. I mean, you're always going to have some attrition because of death or health, etc. But as you engage people holistically, you'll find attrition will start to drop pretty dramatically, without a doubt. There's some really cool research that's in the field by a nonprofit economist who studies donor behavior, and he can show that for every 10% reduction in attrition, that we'll see on average a 200 to 400% increase in lifetime giving value of that donor pool. So, and that's for every 10%. I mean, when you look at the compounding magnitude of those numbers are huge when you think about sustainability of an organization, just by reducing attrition. Because if we reduce attrition, I'm going to focus on what? The relationship and how I engage somebody holistically. I want to spend a few minutes and talk about this from a context of who gives. We already said the number one driver of who gives is what?
Involvement.
Absolutely. And if we think of demographic, number one is going to be volunteers. And we're talking about that holistic involvement. So the number one driver in the United States, if we want to predict who's going to give, it'd be those who are involved, without a doubt. And then those who are involved first as volunteers. Number two, and I guess we could even put this as higher than volunteers because it's a bigger proportion, are people of faith. So we know that in the United States, on average, again, depending on whose research you go with, but the range is somewhere between about 83, 84% to 90% of all individual donors in the United States are people of faith. We don't know what faith. They claim they attend a religious service once a month or more for an hour. So they're engaged in some kind of faith. It's not the person who just says, hey, I'm a person of faith. They're people who are acting in some way on a faith stance, whatever that is. But we do know that on average, Christians give 14 times more per household than any other faith or non-faith affiliation. That's huge. 14 times more. Equate that to a percentage. It's 1,400% higher than any other affiliation of any form coming from Christian households within a faith entire demographic. The third is women. Women, on average, a female who is the same age and same economic strata as a male, on average, will give about 150% more than their male counterpart. Doesn't mean the men aren't important, but just when we look at comparative giving, an individual female at the same age and economic strata will typically give more than that male. And the fourth, families. which on average give 120% more than single individuals. So if I want to know the 4 leading edge indicators of who gives in the United States, this is it. What we can also show is that when we factor out all religious causes, because religious causes more than anything else tend to be individual gift driven, when you factor out all of them, individuals still make up nearly 77% of all money that's given to charitable organizations. So, which would be given to all secular causes. When you look at faith-oriented individuals, the research I've seen anyway runs at like 72 to 73% of all money that's given to completely secular causes still comes from faith-centered individuals. Again, we don't know what faith, but faith individuals are driving the vast majority of faith-centered giving and faith-neutral giving in the United States. So this tells me, these are leading edge indicators. If I want to know who's giving, am I engaging these constituencies? And there are others, but these are the 4 biggest drivers of who gives in the United States. This giving, as I mentioned earlier, looks like about 1.9% of household giving that goes to charitable causes. The average denominational family gives about 2.3% of their income to charity. And some of you have probably heard this before, but MT Tomb and some other research organizations identify that we are about, in essence, about $890 to $900 million short of fulfilling the Great Commission on an annual basis if only the 38 million members of the 11 core or mainline denominations were to take a year off from retirement and put that money into the Great Commission. We'd have an extra $100 billion in 1 year. We'd fund the Great Commission 100 times over just by devaluing retirement for 1 year and putting that money into kingdom work. I mean, that's the degree of undergiving that we have in the United States, yet we're, by way of proportion of giving and value of giving, the highest in giving of any other country in the world. It shows you the potential that we have. And if you go back to all the things we've talked about, why donors stop giving, what you soon see is that we typically give donors a lot more reasons not to give than to give. If the average donor stops giving and they still love cats, but they feel like that they're just a commodity, then why am I going to enter into a sacrificial relationship? I'm not. That relationship and where I put my holistic relationship either doesn't get developed or it remains token. Every year we take basically their training cohorts of philanthropists through a year-long program that I do, and there's 2 levels of it. And I start them out at the beginning of the year, and we basically teach them through the year how to create impact, how to find their calling, how to then create change, and how to create impact both in the organizations that they're wanting to support and within their families. And it's amazing to me, I mean, it's almost a broken record, how many of them come out of that program saying, I was just writing checks. Even with my church, like I didn't understand what holistic relationship could look like and the joy that comes out of that. And so it's up to us to help shape people, whether that's an individual who's funding a missionary, a parachurch organization, a church, or a secular organization. It's up to the organization to help people find that place of being. It's part of their calling, and it's part of our calling to create this mutual synergy in the relationship. So when you look at total giving, just who gives, the percentages, you can see, again, there's a lot of undergiving within the United States. And I'll close this just with an understanding of the church and the missionary, because this has a big impact, both within the church and missionary field, but even without. There's a lot of insecurity that comes along with some of these things within the church, that somehow when a church starts to support a missionary, that the donor is going to stop giving to my church because they're supporting a missionary. And what's fascinating is the research shows the exact opposite happens, that the more individual people in a congregation support missionaries, giving inside the church actually goes up as opposed to down, which is, again, another one of the insecurities that we often carry in the field, just like how we engage people holistically, that when people get engaged in kingdom building, they give more to everybody. There's some really cool research that shows that people who financially give to organizations live longer, they recover from heart attacks and strokes quicker, they're on average have lower blood pressure, and they're overall healthier than individuals who aren't financially giving to charitable organizations. You could do an entire promotion around giving is good for your health. And there are just so many things that come because God's wired us to be generous and to use His resources around the things that we're called to be a part of. So any questions on, I've thrown a number of stats, but just any perspectives that I need to unpack a little deeper with this before we move on?
Are those compounded? So like the married Christian woman that has a family that volunteers, are they like, I mean, does it add up?
Yeah.
To those seven, or okay.
Yeah, so I could separate these out, but then when I start to coalesce them together, the impact becomes even bigger. And we see that in our own donor research as well. Great question. Okay. Next thing we're going to talk about just briefly is we're going to begin to view this more from a value exchange. And so I want to ask a question, I guess, just from what we've talked about so far. When someone gives to your organization or to any organization, what's the value exchange that's happening? I should ask, do you believe there's a value exchange? Do you believe that the donor receives value when they give to your organization? And if so, what kind of value do they receive?
They're investing in kingdom work.
Okay, and so the value that I receive by investing in kingdom work is I get to be a part of something that I can't be a part of, right? Absolutely. So there's an eternal aspect if I give to your organization, and then there's also a temporal aspect that I'm a part of kingdom building right now, here and now, that I can't be without you, allowing me the opportunity to be a part of what you're doing. Absolutely. So there's a true value exchange that's happening when I give to a charitable organization. And I want you to think about this by way of fundraising. There's a great saying by the founder of the School of Philanthropy and the Fundraising School at Indiana University, Hank Rousseau, made this really cool quote that I'd heard one time, and that was that if you truly understand philanthropy, as we've talked about it, then you realize that fundraising is nothing more than a servant of philanthropy. All fundraising is a vehicle that allows civil society to invest in its values. And that's it. That's all we're doing. We're shaping the way which we create a channel for people to engage in their values. Whether we like those values or not is not the question or the answer, but we're creating channels for people to engage in these values. So fundraising typically then has two modes or two models. One is what we're going to list as demand side. Demand side fundraising programs or philosophies are focused on, I have a need and you're the limited resource that's out there, and so I have to coerce, convince, whatever I need to do to get you to take your limited resources and put it into my need, but there is not a recognition that we're in a supply-side relationship. So I'm demanding limited resources into whatever my need is, but I'm not giving anything back. Does that make sense? That's a demand-side fundraising model. That's a demand-side economy. It's a very much an import-driven economy as opposed to importing and exporting. That stands in contrast to a supply-side philosophy, which is that I understand that there is a demand, there is something that we have need for, but it's the relationship. And in that relationship, we are supplying intrinsic value to the individual who shares with us this cause, this calling, whatever it is. This looks like transactional donor engagement. This looks like long-term relational engagement. I heard a really great individual make a comment. Salvation Army International, which is the large international umbrella of Salvation Army, has one of the strongest plan giving programs there are. And I heard the executive vice president over plan giving, and that's not his real title, but whatever his quasi-military title would be, but that's basically, in my world, that's what he is. And he was talking about plan giving, and someone asked him, how is it that you guys have such a strong plan giving program in Salvation Army International? And his comment was, it was very easy. We see the donor as a 30-year relationship as opposed to a 3-year transaction. And that was the difference. Everything that, in his mind, that they do has an understanding that this person's going to be here in 30 years, either being blessed or cursed by what we've done in that relationship, which is dramatically different than me viewing somebody as a 3-year churn and burn process, which unfortunately whereas a lot of fundraising programs are. The donor is a transaction, the donor is a commodity, and we build a lot of baggage in the field because of this. Donors think that their value is a checkbook. We have a client we work with who's a major Christian recording and artist, philanthropist, etc. And when we started working with him, his comment was that he believed holistically that, he said, Jamie, I think maybe 99, 98% of all Christian organizations, and this is a Christian recording artist, will never value me for anything more than my money and my international platform. And that's it. He struggled even at the thought that he would ever be valued in a supply-side relationship with an organization that God had called him to be about. Now, he's since changed in that perspective over the last couple of years. But when we started working with him, that's where he was, because of this baggage he carried in the field of always being seen as a commodity. And that's so important to realize, is that while you may not view the donor that way, other people may have. And part of what we have to do in the field is to create the witness and the model to reacculturate individuals that we value people and that we value people with shared calling with us. And that doesn't happen just because I tell you I think this way. It happens because I show you. And what is the witness that we perpetuate within our ministry or within our organization, and how we carry that out. Supply side versus demand side becomes a choice that we have to make philosophically within the organization. And that leads us to the last thing I want to cover in this segment, and that is a process of engagement. And I'm just going to put up here 2 little arrows and then a cycle. I'm going to write seek, serve, listen, translate, transmit. And then over here, I'm going to put seek, serve, listen, translate, transmit. And this is a process that happens in-house and out of house, or within my organization and outside of my organization. And inside, what I'm constantly doing is I'm seeking those individuals who have what? Shared vision, shared values with our calling, whatever that is. And then as I'm seeking them, I'm serving with them. So those are now people that are in my organization that I've aligned, volunteers, my team, whatever that might be, who are serving, and we're growing together in what God is revealing to us about service. This could be a missionary in the field with volunteers. And then I am listening what is being revealed. And then I'm translating this into why it matters to the people who are part of this calling. And then once I translate, I'm transmitting it. And then as I go externally, I'm identifying the people that we are serving with outside of our organization. This might be our beneficiaries. This might be the people who are coming into a new church. This might be the people who we're reaching in a new community, a village, whatever that might be. And as I'm serving, as I'm seeking them, I'm serving with them, and I'm listening to what they're seeing about how we are creating impact and change. And then I'm listening to them to take that understanding, to translate it into what are we hearing and why does it matter? And then I'm translating that back into my organization. so that I'm constantly in this process of renewing the call and helping people to become what? An advocate, which is the core of what all of this is about. If I'm a cause-driven individual or organization, if my focus isn't just selling widgets or doing something, I'm truly about creating holistic kingdom change, then my focus is how do I help people to become intercessors, advocates around that shared calling? What do you think happens when this process stops?
Go low cat somewhere else.
That's right. What happens to the cause itself or the organization that's a part of this?
Plateaus, I guess. You're not growing, you're not reaching new heights,
Right?
new things.
Absolutely. And what starts to fall apart internally? Let me ask you this. If this is functioning, what happens?
You're fulfilling your vision.
Right? Because we're engaging and we're creating renewal. When this process stops, then what happens? We start to stagnate the cause and the vision, and we don't drive renewal. It's amazing, when we're working with organizations, and we have about 10 clients, I guess now 12, that are over 100 years old, some that are as high as 180 years old. And it's not about length of relationship of the organization, how old they are, but you can look at a 106-year-old organization or a 5-year-old organization and diagnose what's happening if you first go in with this lens. Because if this process is broken, you'll see the same symptoms happen. They might look a little bit differently, but they're going to come out. The outcomes are going to be there. If you just use this to start to diagnose where an organization is, you'll start to learn so much about the organization. Just ask these questions. So if I'm building an organization, whether that's an individual missionary, whether that's a parachurch ministry, a church, or a secular organization, if I build it with this understanding that I'm going to protect this in the DNA. And the core of that's going to drive things like intimacy and authenticity and how I engage people in the cause, because now I'm focused on true co-ownership because I'm building advocates as opposed to organizational ownership or even persona-centric causes. That won't happen in this structure because now I'm creating constant renewal in the process. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd be interested, you talked a little bit earlier about, faith-based nonprofits still increasing and giving in churches going down for the last 25 years. From your experience, especially with us, right now we're kind of riding the high of kind of almost operating, like a parachurch cause
Right.
in a way.
Yep.
So where do you often see this process breaking down in the traditional church, structure in your experience?
Yeah. A big part of that, which we're going to answer, there's another element to this, which is vision, that we're going to talk about in a minute. But where this often breaks down in the traditional church is the element over here. This could be happening internally, but it doesn't happen externally. And so people are sitting in the pews that aren't able to engage, not able to connect, they don't see value, and they're not being sought as partners in cause. They're being sought, and hear this in the right way, but I'm shocked at how many times I hear people, pastors in churches, that are shocked at the idea that they should have to engage their congregation at a relational, intimate way around giving. That somehow, because the Bible talks about giving 2,300 plus times, or money 2,300 plus times, that they should never have to engage people in an intimate way, that there's a sense of entitlement. And that's the breakdown, is that in essence what that's saying is that the donors become a commodity. The person who sits in the pew becomes a commodity, and you can see those expressed by other metrics that the organization gets stuck on. How many people were here? What do our numbers look like? What does membership look like? Which are fine if we're using it in context of the bigger picture of why does that stuff even matter. So from the church perspective, where we see it most definite is the outside process has just completely fallen apart if it's happening internally. And we've seen that for a long time, as you can see just by the giving. So if this starts to break, then I become a commodity of the church. I'm going to give a token gift. There was a study that came out, it's probably about 10 years ago now, and they looked at major donors who gave a significant sacrificial gift to their college and their endowment or capital campaign in the same year their church was doing a major initiative, but they did not make the gift to their church. And so they asked them why. Why did you give to your college but not your church this large gift when they were both involved at the same time? And they said the number two reasons. Number one was the church didn't know how to ask. And number two was the church didn't know how to say thank you. And what they meant by that was that they felt the church engaged them as a commodity, whereas their college of choice relationship engaged them as a relationship. And when they said that the church didn't know how to say thank you, it was the same thing, that their church didn't know how to affirm them in the relationship, but the college they gave to affirmed them as a partner and that they mattered to the bigger picture. So yeah.
That's great insight, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. Any other questions or thoughts around this?
I heard a really cool story last week, that this camp that we were working with, they have a policy that if anybody gives over $1,000, they hand deliver the receipt to them and thank them personally. And so and then this particular couple had just wrote a $1,500 check. So I thought, we'll just bring them lasagna. So they made them a lasagna dinner, and they just knocked on the door and said, thank you, and we want to bring you lasagna. And so they invited them in, they had this great talk, and then a week later they wrote them a $200,000 check.
Yeah. Yep.
But that's the relation side.
Absolutely.
It wasn't, they could have just sent a nice little thank you in the mail,
Yep.
but they went to them and brought them lasagna,
Absolutely.
and it paid off pretty well.
Yep. Well, and to that point, one of the challenges around this is you'll hear this in the field. I've been in this field since the earlier 90s, and when I got in the field, there was people were starting at that point to talk more about relationship, but it was more around let's raise friends. And now we're finally hearing a lot of language that's about, well, are you doing something that's donor-centric, et cetera, which it's just interesting because biblically, God's talked about this through the entire Bible. And you go all the way back to how the tribes of Israel operated. It was relational and it was holistic. So it's not new that we're talking about. It's just that we're, as with so many other things, we're kind of reinventing what truth has already shown us. What's really interesting, though, in that picture is right now what you'll hear a lot in the field is the idea of donor-centric culture. And what I want to be really clear of, or building friends or a relationship fundraising model, what we're talking about here is still at odds with a relationship model, because what we're talking about is helping people find their calling in your ministry. And that's very different than whether I just hand sign a letter to you. That's part of it. Like, I have to build relationship, but truly putting a culture of philanthropy in place means that I am seeking to engage you holistically and for you to find your potential in this call, whatever that is. And so when you take this information and you hear it in the field, excuse me?
Yeah, I get that. That's total, yeah.
Right. There's just a whole nother understanding and level of it. And I can go through all the things around relationship-based fundraising and still never fully engage you at your calling.
Because what is your calling?
Exactly.
So we're there to help them figure that out.
Yes. And because of that, and we're going to hit this later, but you're absolutely right. We are in the field as a coach, as a partner with God's people. And that's secular or faith-based, His creation, to help them find their calling. And so if that's my focus, if I take that seriously, then if I engage you and you decide that this isn't the place you're supposed to be, that's okay. Because now I've helped you become better. And just like in some of your organizations and in the church, where if this isn't the church for you, that's okay. But we want to help you figure that out. And the other thing I would say with that is, especially as it relates to engaging the donor, every once in a while I'll have, especially people in parachurch or church-based ministries who will say, well, I get this, but it still feels a little bit ulterior motive. Like, okay, I want you to give, and I'm building relationship holistically so you'll find your calling, because at the end of the day, you're going to give more and volunteer more to my organization. And this came up to me in a training I was doing, and there was an individual who was there who I had worked with over the years in a very close way, and I asked him, kind of use him as an example, and the point I made to him was, I am a donor to his organization, and he has for years had an intentionality in helping me grow in my faith as someone who's supporting his organization. And he knows that if I'm growing in my faith and that his organization is part of my calling, I'm going to give more to his ministry. And my expectation is that he never lets up on that. And that's my response to individuals who have that concern, is that you should never apologize for giving people the opportunity to be a part of what you're doing, because that's our calling. You're there. And if you don't do it, then either no one else will, or the people who really don't care are going to shape my perspectives, and you're going to end up like the person that I mentioned earlier, our philanthropist recording artist, who felt that 98% of all ministries would never value him for anything more than his money and his platform. So don't ever feel that you have to be insecure or apologize to anybody, because your job, your motive should always be that you're helping me find my calling and my potential, and helping me give, and give generously, and give transformatively, whether that's to your organization or any others, it doesn't matter. But that's what our motive is. My motive is always unapologetically to help individuals find that place of giving all of themselves. And if that's your organization, then that's going to be great. If that's to your ministry, then that's going to be great. Or you're going to help them find out where they're supposed to be. We're really glad you bring that up.
Do you think the breakdown in that is that they're just focused on the relationship and they never get there and we don't know, or is the breakdown the insecurity or the pride of not wanting, like, being afraid that they're going to leave, or feeling like this is my thing, not like you understand what I'm saying?
I think in the field, unfortunately, there are a lot of organizations that will do things because they understand the economics of it, but they don't understand the cause of it. So I'll make sure you're thanked because I know that I need to keep you so that you'll give more.
Right.
But that's different than a motivation. Yeah, the motive isn't to help you figure out your greatest level of calling in my organization. It's that there are relational things that I know are just good best practices that are going to help make sure you stay.
And I'm sure you're going to get to this, but I'm, just even listening to you, it's obviously more systemic to a deeper, which is why probably some of what I've seen in nonprofits is empowering the donor in how they give and what aspects they give, where they feel like they have ownership,
right?
Connected to what they believe is their purpose, rather than just say, give to this, we're going to allot the funds where we want to,
right?
Just as long as we hit our bottom line, and instead flipping this, flipping and empowering their donors probably,
Absolutely.
Makes it, I don't know, just listening to you, it feels more
Absolutely.
systemic than just, let me just build a relationship with you so I can still use your money the way I want to use it, and
Right.
Disconnect you from the process. So.
Absolutely. Which, and to your point, comes back to whether I believe that God's a God of abundance or a God of scarcity. Because if I put God in a box and I think that he's a God of scarcity, I'll never get to the point that you're talking about. But if I believe that God's a God of abundance, and now I'm in his economy, then those insecurities, they can't live in the same space. Because I don't control his economy, to your point. So yeah, it's a really good point. Okay, any other questions on this part? Okay, let's take just a couple minute break and we'll switch modules and we'll come back.